Today I'm going to be presenting research from my forthcoming book titled Undocumented Fears, Immigration and the Politics of Divide and Conquer in Hazleton, Pennsylvania. The book explores the politics surrounding Hazleton's 2006 passage of the Illegal Immigration Relief Act, or IIRA. This is an ordinance that was going to punish businesses and landlords who hired or rented to undocumented immigrants and make English the official language of the city. Hazleton's law is significant because it put Hazleton at the epicenter of the immigration debate. It helped kick off a parade of exclusionary local and state level initiatives, exclusionary anti-immigrant initiatives, which notably included Arizona's highly visible SB 1070 in 2010. As an aside that will have significance later, I should also note that this happens to be a personal case for me, as Hazleton is where I grew up. I'm going to start us with a short video clip that's going to set up my analysis.
Nestled deep in the Pocono Mountains, Hazleton, Pennsylvania has the look and the feel of an all-American town. Most of the people who turned out for the annual end-of-summer parade are descendants of immigrants who came here in the 19th or early 20th century, including the mayor. The Barlettas came from Italy and ended up with a road named after them.
Good job, Mayor! Way to go!
Now the mayor is making a name for himself by going after a different kind of immigrant.
Keep the illegals out!
I'm going to eliminate illegal aliens from the city of Hazleton.
Barletta believes what's been going on in Hazleton is a microcosm of what's been going on all over the country, that illegal immigrants are overwhelming his city, draining its resources, and ruining the quality of life. Last summer, Mayor Barletta and the City Council tried to change that by pulling in the welcome mat. They passed an ordinance called the Illegal Immigration Relief Act, which punishes local businesses and landlords who give work or shelter to illegal aliens.
The anthropologist Leo Chavez writes that media coverage of immigration and the debate over the issue more generally is characterized by what he calls a Latino threat narrative. This narrative, he writes, posits that Latinos are not like previous immigrant groups who ultimately became part of the nation. According to the assumptions and taken-for-granted truths inherent in this narrative, Latinos are unwilling or incapable of integrating, of becoming part of the national community. Rather, they are seen as part of an invading force from south of the border that is bent on destroying the American way of life. Although it may look innocuous on its surface, I find this clip to be a useful tool for illuminating how this narrative is used to fit local-level immigration debates, particularly in small interior communities such as Hazleton. Notice how the narrator explicitly states that Hazleton confronts, quote, a different kind of immigrant. The clip presents the harms undocumented immigrants have allegedly committed in Hazleton rather uncritically, and they remain unverified. It's as though the narrator assumes that you and I both know that there is some truth to them. For that matter, we get no complexities about the immigration experience, where these folks came from, why they left home, or how they ended up in Hazleton. In fact, I would argue that rather than simply being overly narrow, this depiction barely presents Hazleton's recent immigrants as human beings. What we get instead are images, caricatures. Notice how the celebratory music suddenly stopped when the screen flashed to a person walking into the Latino grocery store. Notice how we didn't even see that person's face. The same is true as the narrator described the particulars of the ordinance. The image he talks over is of a shadowy figure wearing a hooded jacket walking on a dark, rainy day. In sharp contrast, Hazleton is depicted as an idealized place. It never mentions that this means a white place. But when juxtaposed with such imagery of threatening outsiders, the message is nevertheless come across. As the clip opens, we are told Hazleton has the, quote, look and feel of an all-American town. It's portrayed as a place rich in traditions, such as its annual end-of-summer parade. The blaring tubas and smiling cheerleaders walking down the street waving their pom-poms in unison give us the sense that this is a pleasant place, or at least that it was. We are told it's an immigrant town, but it's implied that, unlike today's newcomers, the folks here have lived and achieved the American dream. getting streets named after them, for example. In fact, the depiction is so idyllic that the story's hook, the very reason it becomes worthy of being carried by a national news network in the first place, is that, as is written in the written version of the 60 Minutes report, the, quote, problem of illegal immigration has now made its way, of all places, into Hazleton, Pennsylvania. I argue in my book that this kind of narrative plays a crucial role in maintaining racial and economic inequality. In terms of race, part of the story should already be clear. Only in a context of dehumanization does it become acceptable to speak of eliminating a group of people, as the mayor does in this clip. Indeed, a growing body of research shows that discrimination, harassment, and psychological distress increase among Latino populations, regardless of immigration or legal status, when laws like this get passed. Moreover, the ruthless economic exploitation that is the dirty little secret of the U.S. immigration system becomes easier to justify when we no longer see the people who are exploited as people. But what I do is take this a step further by thinking about how race and class intersect in these debates. In contrast to the 60 Minutes depiction, I can say firsthand that my city isn't pretty, and I'm comfortable admitting that. Hazleton's a former coal mining town, a fact that its scarred landscape cannot hide. The mining industry was devastated in the early 20th century when oil became the nation's dominant energy source. In the 1950s, it managed to recover by building an industrial park that attracted manufacturing firms in the decades that followed. However, as we know all too well here in Dayton, manufacturing has since declined substantially. As you see here, Hazleton's Luzerne County has lost more than half of all of its manufacturing jobs since 1980. Through an analysis of economic development archives, I link these changes in my book to the neoliberal ideology of the Reagan administration, which initiated in particular drastic cuts in federal funding for community economic development programs that devastated Hazleton. Left to fend for themselves without government support and desperate to remain economically viable in what became a hyper-competitive climate, Hazleton entered what is commonly termed the race to the bottom. In the late 1990s, developers in Hazleton turned to a state-level tax incentive called the Keystone Opportunity Zone Initiative. The hope was that KOZ would lure corporations with its promise of a moratorium on all taxes for 12 years. For companies who would agree to open up shop in certain zones. Clearly, this is a powerful tool for attracting industry, yet it's important not to overlook that while corporations forego millions of dollars in taxes because of this legislation, at the end of the day, this means that there are fewer funds for schools, parks, and the like in an already struggling city. Jobs came because of KOZ, but not the type of jobs that folks in the city were used to. Instead, in the early 2000s, Hazleton welcomed a number of warehouses, distribution centers, and a meatpacking plant, industries that are notorious for offering low wages, long hours, temporary employment, difficult working conditions, and hyper-surveillance over their workers. These type of firms are also notorious for exploiting immigrant labor. Latino migrants, many in search of the best option neoliberal capitalism affords them, began arriving from the Dominican Republic, Mexico, Guatemala, and Peru, among many other mostly Latin American countries, many places which have similarly been hard hit economically, in particular by so-called free trade agreements like NAFTA. What we have then are two populations who are suffering economically because of very similar political economic shifts. Yet while I was in the field, I almost never heard this economic backstory. It was not part of the narrative that I was hearing. It's not part of what folks were talking about. In line with what W.E.B. Du Bois famously wrote in his classic book, Black Reconstruction, I argue that despite having what he called practically identical interests as immigrant laborers, the white working class residents of this city have been encouraged to see themselves as white rather than as members of the working class. They have been offered and have accepted, in other words, what has been called a racial bribe, a willingness to endure economic hardship and contribute to the oppression of poor and working people of color in exchange for what Du Bois called the psychological wage that accompanies whiteness. To say that another way, rather than aligning with fellow workers to protest shared economic subordination, the Latino threat narrative I described at the beginning prevailed in this local debate, and the story we get is a story of white residents who are suffering because of immigrants. This is what I mean by the politics of divide and conquer. Racism puts some groups down, but it also lifts whites up. Parallel processes that I refer to as Latino degradation and white affirmation. And when it does this, it creates fractures within the working class that, one, make it difficult to organize for economic justice, and two, prompt many whites to direct their animosity downward at groups who are more marginalized than themselves rather than upward at, for example, the 85 people who claim more of the world's wealth than the bottom 50% of the world's population, or about 3.5 billion of us. What prevails then is a narrative that is inconsistent with the realities of racial and economic injustice. The dominant narrative problematically identifies whites as the only group enduring harm, not the actual harm they confront as workers, but an imaginary racialized harm that they claim to be confronting as whites. So to kind of show you some empirical examples of this, I found this to be the case when I analyzed rhetoric officials used to justify the ordinance following allegations that two undocumented Latino men murdered a white Hazleton resident. Officials degraded recent immigrants by declaring criminality to be a part of the essential nature of people without documentation, as you can see in the first quote there, which quite obviously, in many cases I found, became code for Latinos more generally. Whereas primarily white residents as presumably white Hazleton residents, were granted a symbolic uplift when they were depicted as inherently pure and virtuous, as you see in the other quote, and therefore as worthy of protection from them. I found this to be the case as well, as officials expanded their rhetoric to include accusations that undocumented immigrants sap city resources. As the particular language of the ordinance that I have blown up here clearly displays, undocumented immigrants were cast as responsible for so many of the city's fiscal problems, and as such, were considered to be destroying our way of life, as the ordinance says. I found this also to be the case when I did focus groups and interviews with ordinary working-class white Hazletonians. In their stories, most in fact, lamented about how their city has changed, reminiscing fondly about the good old days and bitterly explaining the current situation. Upon closer inspection, however, these nostalgic recollections of a harmonious, all-American city and complaints about newcomers were mirror images of one another. We, the narrative said, we in quotes, we're quiet, rooted, and law-abiding, among other things, the stories went. They, in contrast, are loud, transient, and lawless. And finally, I found this to be the case after interviewing and observing local activist groups on both sides of this local debate. To make a long story short, a small group of Latino activists challenged the ordinance locally and challenged the narrative I've been describing. They held vigils in the city and spoke out in front of city council against the law. Making little headway there, they turned to the ACLU and other litigating groups who were ultimately able to defeat the IRA in court, keeping it from ever being enforced. Despite the law being on their side, however, I found that throughout the pro-immigrant activist campaign, the community majority engaged in what legal scholar Ian Haney Lopez calls racial jujitsu. They refused to take claims of discrimination against Latinos seriously, using those claims instead as evidence that pro-immigrant activists are harming welcoming Hazletonians by demanding special as opposed to equal rights and bringing race into a supposedly raceless debate. What we see then is that the list of so-called enemies that are seen to have disaffected this community gradually expands over time. Over the course of many years I was studying this. It includes now not only undocumented immigrant criminals, as it was the case when it started, but also so-called fiscal burdens, so-called messy and unfriendly neighbors, and later anyone who advocated on behalf of immigrants. Special rights activists, powerful litigators like the ACLU, activist judges like the judge who declared the ordinance unconstitutional, and I'm sure, after my book is released, liberal academics. Never are political economic realities discussed. Never is the political economic backstory that I just gave mentioned. Instead, at every turn, a collective vision of what Hazleton is, a collective identity for the community is constructed in direct contrast to these racialized vilifications. Given what I've said, it probably doesn't come as much of a surprise to learn that none of this was true. As research has shown in the case across the country, immigrants do not increase crime and actually help to reduce it. In Hazleton in particular, undocumented immigrants accounted for 0.25% of all arrestees between 2001, when the immigrant population began increasing, and 2006, when the ordinance was passed. There was no evidence given at the city council meetings or at the trial over the law that immigrants were fiscally harming the city. Yet there is plenty of evidence on the ground to show that newcomers revived local institutions and a decaying downtown. Local resident stories that I heard lacked a chronology. They didn't vary over time. It was the past and the present, and I heard very similar stories from people in their 20s as I did from people in their 60s and 70s. It appeared, in other words, as though folks were remembering what they chose to remember about the past and seeing what they chose to see about the present. Each of these claims, including especially the assertion that people of color are the, quote, special favorites of the law, have deep historical roots in this country, which in each case we can trace back to slavery and or the nativism directed toward prior immigrant groups. These are age-old narratives. I want to ask, kind of to start the conclusion, that we don't walk away from here, we don't interpret this as to think that the majority of us who can kind of scorn at this narrative are superior to the ignorant folks in this Pennsylvania town. As a former resident of this city, I take offense to that. You better not say that. I take offense to that because the folks here are suffering, right? The decline of manufacturing has hurt people in serious ways in this town. I don't condone at all the racism that we've seen there. In fact, I despise it. But the point I want to make is that this is how elites and the dominant ideologies that govern our country have long taught those of us who are white to make sense of the world. This has brought centuries of pain and suffering to people of color and has served the interests of elites, the economic interests of elites, by keeping us divided. In Hazleton, in other communities, and in the U.S. more broadly. In other words, facts and logic aren't the issue here, not because people are stupid, but because they've been offered and have accepted a narrative that seems to make sense, because it both accounts for their declining social position and aligns with the racist common sense that is so deeply embedded in our culture. Which leads me to the question, so what do we do, right? What is the case I'm making instead? Rather than offering some grandiose vision for comprehensive immigration reform, the short version of what I argue in the conclusion of my book is that we need to learn our history. It may sound cliche, but in order to resist these inequality-perpetuating politics, we need to build from the bottom up an understanding of what happened in the past that will create an active citizenry and enable the development of collective identities that are authentically rooted in the realities we confront rather than in economic distortions and racialized myths. I'm actually also surprised that this happened in Hazleton, to be honest. I'm not surprised because I think it's an idyllic place, as the 60 Minutes video suggested, but I'm surprised because Hazleton has one of the richest histories of labor organizing of any American city, despite its size. This is a photo of a group of mostly Slovak immigrant coal miners. Hazleton sits on a bed of anthracite coal, and that was its primary economy back then. The photo shows a group of mostly Slovak immigrant coal miners who were marching through Hazleton in 1897 to protest coal barons ruthlessly exploiting them for their labor. Deaths and many other abuses were common, as well as low pay and the like in Hazleton's mines. This particular strike escalated to include more than 10,000 workers. As they often did then, too, the barons tried pitting ethnic groups against one another by offering petty benefits to some. But in this particular instance, the tactic failed. Established groups and recent arrivals came together in pursuit of a common cause. The miners you see here were on their way to a coal mine in Latimer, a town that's on the periphery of Hazleton. By this point in the strike, it was the only mine that was still in operation. And so the bosses realized that if the strikers were able to get there and shut the mine down, they would eventually have to concede to the strikers' demands. So they understandably scrambled for a solution. They enlisted the help of the county sheriff, whose name was James Martin, a man who historians note, quote, owed his livelihood to the coal barons and knew whom he had to please if he wanted to remain sheriff and avoid going back to the mines where he worked since the age of 7. Martin formed a posse of 87 deputies, each of them equipped with a Winchester rifle supplied by the mine owners. When the miners got to Latimer, the sheriff ordered them to stop, but they continued on, prompting the deputies to open fire into the unarmed crowd, killing 19 and wounding dozens more. Many miners had entry wounds in their backs, fired upon as they retreated. Witnesses said they heard deputies shouting ethnic slurs at some who were laying on the ground, bleeding. I have this photo hanging on the wall in my office because it does some of the things for me as an individual that I think we ought to do as a collective. It historically roots my identity as a working class person, reminding me that the work that I do is part of an ongoing struggle. It gives me a sense of the past beyond the empty nostalgia that I've been fed about the good old days in small town America. It helps me contextualize the current mistreatment of immigrants. Rather than the meritocratic story of the American dream, it helps me recall the degradation and violence each successive group of immigrants has confronted in the United States, and reminds me how the exploitation of immigrant labor has long fueled our capitalist system. It makes me question my own privilege. Do I want to be James Martin and sell my soul for petty benefits? Or do I want to march in pursuit of justice for all? But most importantly, it serves as a reminder of how powerful we become when we unite. The ending in this case was tragic, to be sure, but the guns came out only because the tactic was working. In other words, otherwise powerless, ordinary people become what Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. called an unsettling force when we come together in solidarity across racial and ethnic lines. Thank you.